Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Minerals, Rocks, and Fossil Talks. I'm your paleontology teacher, Jen, and it's Throwback Thursday. Today we're going to talk about the curious case of Brontosaurus. So, everyone's heard of Brontosaurus. It's like one of the top 5 dinosaurs that kids learn, like right off the bat, up there with like Tyrannosaurus and Spinosaurus and Velociraptor and Triceratops. However, did you know that Brontosaurus had a bit of a rocky past? And I don't mean the fact that, it's a fossil found in rocks. I'm talking about it's gone through a bit of an existential crisis. So, let's learn a little bit about our Brontosaurus. Brontosaurus was discovered in 1879 by Othniel Charles Marsh, or at the very least, the crew he hired, during the height of the infamous Bone Wars. It was collected from Como Bluff, Wyoming, and it was a nearly complete skeleton, which is super impressive just in general. But they would come to find that happens a lot in the Morrison Formation. This formation, like rocks at articulated, nearly complete specimens. Anyway, all it was missing was the head, which is also very typical of sauropods. Sauropods are very large dinosaurs with really dinky heads. And those heads pop off after, the ligaments decay, and then the skull disarticulates and just, scatters into lots of little pieces and then floats down rivers and just kind of disappear. Which is very frustrating for us because, man, skulls are one of the easiest way to tell things apart. Yeah, welcome to our life. So at this time, the Morrison Formation was at the center of the Bone Wars conflict. So Marsh was feeling rushed and pressured to publish on his new find before his rival Edward Drinker Cope had the opportunity to publish something new first. So even though he hoped to recover a skull, and he waited a little while before he did this because he really wanted that skull, Marsh opted to publish without it and named it Brontosaurus excelsus. Now, the Yale Peabody Museum couldn't display a headless skeleton. That's just how they were back then. They wanted full skeletons. They didn't want just pieces of animals to put on display. It just wasn't cool that way. So they decided to sculpt one. Now, as I mentioned before, sauropod skulls are not easy to come by, so they didn't have very many skulls to reference. The only skulls that had been found with any substance to this point were Camarasaurus. And, I mean, look at this. This is a fairly substantial skull for a sauropod. Large, thick skull. And there were a few Brachiosaurus fragments. Funny enough, Brachiosaurus is actually one of the few sauropods where we haven't found a few sauropods from the Morrison Formation that we have not found a complete skull for. So we don't actually know what that one looks like in its entirety. Everything we know about it actually comes from Giraffatitan. But we'll talk about that more tomorrow. So what they did is they took a composite of Camarasaurus and Brachiosaurus and put that together. Now, what's really funny is that Camarasaurus and Brachiosaurus, not anywhere remotely closely related to Brontosaurus, who was a diplodocid, while these two are macronarians. If you don't know what I mean by that, you can check out my Monday musings on sauropod phylogeny. It's a 2-parter video that's super good, so take a look into that and it'll teach you a little bit about sauropod families. So the macronarian versus diplodocid skulls are actually very different. So this is Diplodocus. This should have been closer to what Brontosaurus' skull would look like. And Apatosaurus for that matter, because they did not have an Apatosaurus skull either at the time. However, because they made a composite of Camarasaurus and Brachiosaurus, they came up with this monstrosity, which frankly looks like it belongs to a mammal, not a dinosaur. It's just, it's terrifying. Whew. So this is what they used to think Brontosaurus's head looked like. So yeah. So in 1903, Elmer Riggs, who was the man who discovered Brachiosaurus, looked at Brontosaurus and Apatosaurus and was like, dude, guys, these are not different enough to be separate genus, to be a separate genera. Separate species, maybe, but not separate genera. Since Apatosaurus was named first, it got priority in the naming schemes. So Brontosaurus excelsus became Apatosaurus excelsus. However, the general public missed the memo on this, and so Brontosaurus stayed in common literature, which is why it's still in lots of childhood books and things like that, and it was still used in movies and things like that. The general public liked Brontosaurus more than Apatosaurus, which is fair. I mean, Thunder Lizard is a pretty cool name. Then, 100 years later, in 2015, an extensive study was done on the Diplodocid branch, and they concluded that Brontosaurus was a legit genus. Now, usually names don't get revived because it gets confusing when you do things like that, so once a name's been used and then discarded, that name is no longer in the literature. But due to the fact that Brontosaurus survived nearly 100 years of existential crisis, and its popularity was so big in the general public, we decided, you know what, we can still use Brontosaurus, it's fine. To the general public, they're not even going to realize that anything changed at this point. So, why not just make it a real thing again? So, instead of coming up with something new, they just took Apatosaurus excelsus and brought back Brontosaurus excelsus. So now they are cousins, but they are separate. Now, not all paleontologists agree on that. Some still consider Brontosaurus Apatosaurus. I mean, there'll probably always be arguments like this within the field just because it really is so hard to come up with these differences or similarities when we don't have complete skeletons. When we can't find something completely articulated and just have 100% of the bones due to taphonomic bias and things like that, it's gonna be hard. But we can come up with some pretty good ideas, and you know, I like the idea of having Brontosaurus back just because I'm tired of telling people it doesn't exist. And I like sauropods, so the more the merrier, I say. Anyway, that is the short history of how Brontosaurus existed, then didn't exist, then existed again. And if you liked this, I hope you tune in tomorrow for Fossil Friday, where I will be talking about Brachiosaurus altithorax, because we might have one of those at our fossil site that I'm going to in a couple of weeks, and I just love Brachiosaurus. It's a fun one. So I hope you guys tune in tomorrow and learn some new things, and I will fossilize you later.